On July 30th, 2023, 30,000 workers across America woke up to a text message that destroyed their lives with just 11 words. Yellow is shutting down immediately. Do not report to work today. Drivers pulling 80,000-pound loads down interstate highways got the news while they were still rolling. Dock workers showed up to locked gates. Mechanics found their toolboxes sealed behind chain-link fences. Families who had built their lives around yellow trucking paychecks watched almost 100 years of American trucking history vanish in a single morning. But this isn't just another bankruptcy story. This is the story of how a trucking empire that once moved America's freight betrayed everything it stood for and left a $2 billion crater in its wake. The real question isn't how Yellow died. It's how a company that survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the deregulation of the 1980s managed to destroy itself from the inside out. Yellow's roots didn't begin with freight. They began in Oklahoma City with Cleve Harrell's cab business, which later evolved into a freight operation when the Harrell brothers formed Yellow Transit Freight Lines in 1929. From there, the company grew into a trucking giant serving the region. For 8 decades, that promise built an empire that became America's freight backbone. By the late 90s, Yellow Corporation employed nearly 30,000 people, a number that would nearly double following a series of aggressive acquisitions. The foundation was built on 2 unshakable pillars: worker loyalty and customer trust. Drivers stayed with Yellow for 30 years because the company took care of them. Customers shipped with Yellow because they knew their freight would arrive, intact and on schedule. It was a simple equation that worked for generations of American commerce. Yellow's terminals were the heartbeat of American industry. In cities across the country, Yellow's orange and black trucks rolled out every morning, carrying the goods that kept the economy moving. Auto parts from Detroit, electronics from California, all of it moved through Yellow's network with clockwork precision. The company's motto wasn't just marketing, it was a promise that 3 generations of workers had kept. Despite this decades-long legacy, a new era of management began looking at that foundation and seeing something different. They saw inefficiency and missed opportunities. They saw a company that was too comfortable, too set in its ways, too small for the new economy that was coming. What they didn't see was that they were about to tear down everything that made Yellow worth saving. The destruction accelerated in 2003 with a boardroom obsession that would poison everything Yellow touched, a reckless hunger for growth through acquisition. Management made a high-stakes gamble when they bought their chief rival, Roadway Express, in a deal valued at over $1 billion, including debt. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke. Roadway was a powerhouse in less than truckload shipping, with routes that seemingly complemented Yellow's network. Together, they aimed to create a titan that would dominate the American highway. The problem was the debt. Yellow borrowed heavily to make the purchase, loading the company with interest payments that would haunt them for decades. But management was drunk on the possibilities. If one acquisition was good, more had to be better. In 2005, they doubled down with a move that would prove catastrophic. Yellow bought USF Corporation, a collection of regional carriers including Holland Motor Express and New Penn Motor Express, for another $1.4 billion. More debt, more complexity, more promises about synergies and cost savings that existed only in PowerPoint presentations. The math was simple and brutal. Yellow had taken on nearly $3 billion in debt to buy companies that, while profitable on their own, had completely different operating systems, union contracts, and corporate cultures. They'd bought a collection of freight companies and assumed they could weld them together into a single, efficient machine. What Yellow's executives discovered was that buying a trucking company and actually running it are 2 completely different challenges. Each acquisition came with its own technology systems, different software for dispatching, different methods for tracking freight, different ways of billing customers. Roadway's computers couldn't talk to Yellow's computers. Holland's routing system was incompatible with New Penn's network. The operational chaos was immediate and devastating. Drivers would show up for loads that didn't exist because the dispatch systems weren't synchronized. Freight would disappear into the network, sitting in terminals while customers called, frantically asking where their shipments had gone. Bills would be sent to the wrong addresses, or not sent at all. For workers who had spent decades mastering Yellow's way of doing things, The constant changes were maddening. Every few months, there was a new system to learn, a new procedure to follow, a new boss explaining why everything they'd been doing was wrong. The company that had once prided itself on consistency and reliability was now in a constant state of upheaval. But the real killer was the duplication. Yellow now owned multiple companies that served the same routes, competed for the same customers, and operated parallel networks that made no economic sense. They had terminals sitting across the street from each other, both half empty. They had drivers making the same runs for different subsidiaries, burning fuel and labor on routes that should have been consolidated years earlier. Customers started to notice. Delivery times became unpredictable. Damage claims increased as freight was mishandled in the confusion. The customer service that had been Yellow's calling card for 8 decades was crumbling under the weight of systems that didn't work together. And once customers lose confidence in a freight carrier, the damage spreads fast. Freight is not like retail, where a bad experience might cost you one sale. A missed pickup or a lost shipment can shut down a factory line, leave a warehouse empty, or blow up a delivery schedule that took weeks to coordinate. Yellow had spent decades building a reputation on trust, and now it was burning that trust with every late delivery, every lost pallet, and every customer call that ended without an answer. While Yellow was struggling to integrate its acquisitions, the freight industry was being revolutionized by forces completely outside their control. Amazon was transforming how Americans thought about shipping. Instead of businesses sending large shipments between warehouses, consumers were demanding individual packages delivered to their doorsteps within days or even hours. This shift hit Yellow's business model like a sledgehammer. The company had built its network around less than truckload shipping, combining smaller shipments from multiple customers into single trailer loads. It was efficient for the old economy, where manufacturers shipped pallets of goods to retail stores. But in the new economy of e-commerce, customers wanted speed and flexibility, not efficiency. Smaller, nimbler competitors were eating Yellow's lunch. Companies like FedEx Ground and UPS had invested heavily in automated sorting facilities and last-mile delivery networks. They could move a package from a warehouse to a customer's door faster than Yellow could move it between terminals. Regional carriers were also gaining ground. Companies like Old Dominion and Saia had focused on specific geographic areas, building dense networks that could offer better service at lower costs than Yellow's sprawling, coast-to-coast system. They weren't burdened by the debt and complexity that was strangling Yellow. The numbers told the story. Yellow's market share was shrinking every quarter. Customers who had shipped with the company for decades were quietly moving their business to competitors who could deliver better service at competitive prices. As Yellow's financial position deteriorated, management decided the problem was labor costs. The company's drivers and dock workers were represented by the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and their contracts included pension obligations, health benefits, and work rules that management viewed as obstacles to profitability. The relationship between Yellow and the Teamsters had never been smooth, but by the 2010s it had become openly hostile. Every contract negotiation turned into a battle. Management demanded concessions, lower wages, reduced benefits, more flexible work rules. The union fought back, arguing that workers shouldn't pay the price for management's failed acquisition strategy. The tension reached a breaking point in 2018. Yellow demanded that the Teamsters agree to a restructuring plan that would eliminate thousands of jobs and allow the company to move workers between subsidiaries without regard to seniority. The union refused, and Yellow threatened bankruptcy. It was a game of chicken that neither side could win. Yellow needed labor peace to stabilize operations and convince customers to stick with the company. The Teamsters needed Yellow to survive to protect their members' jobs. But trust between the two sides had completely broken down. Workers watched their company's stock price collapse while executives continued to receive bonuses. They saw terminals closing and routes being eliminated while management blamed union contracts for the company's problems. The loyalty that had once bound Yellow's workforce to the company was replaced by resentment and fear. Facing financial collapse, Yellow's management launched their final desperate gamble: One Yellow. This wasn't just a branding change. It was a multi-year slog to integrate all of their subsidiaries under a single operating system. No more Roadway, no more Holland, no more New Penn. Everything was to become Yellow, with unified technology, consolidated terminals, and streamlined operations. On paper, it made sense. The company was burning money operating parallel networks that competed with each other. Consolidation could eliminate redundancies, reduce costs, and create the efficient supercarrier that management had promised investors for nearly 2 decades. But the plan required something Yellow no longer had: time, money, and trust. Integrating the technology systems alone would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and take years to complete. Closing terminals and consolidating routes would disrupt service during the transition, driving away customers who were already looking for alternatives. Most critically, the plan required cooperation from the Teamsters. Workers would need to be retrained, relocated, and in many cases, laid off. The union would have to agree to changes in work rules and seniority systems that had been negotiated over decades. The Teamsters looked at Yellow's track record and said no. They'd watched management fumble every previous integration attempt. They'd seen promises of job security turn into pink slips. They weren't willing to bet their members' livelihoods on another management scheme that seemed designed to eliminate union jobs. Without labor cooperation, One Yellow was doomed from the start. But management pressed ahead anyway, convinced they could force the changes through negotiation or, if necessary, bankruptcy court. As One Yellow stumbled forward, Yellow's customers began jumping ship in earnest. Major shippers who had relied on the company for decades started moving their business to competitors. They couldn't afford to have their freight caught in the chaos of another failed integration. The customer defections created a vicious cycle. As revenue dropped, Yellow had less money to invest in the technology and infrastructure improvements that One Yellow required. As service deteriorated during the botched integration, more customers left. Each quarter brought worse financial results and more desperate cost-cutting measures. Yellow's debt burden, accumulated during the acquisition spree of the 2000s, became an anchor dragging the company toward the bottom. Interest payments consumed cash that should have been invested in operations. Credit rating agencies downgraded Yellow's bonds, making it even more expensive to borrow money. In a final desperate move, Yellow turned to the federal government for help. In 2020, the company received a $700 million loan from the Treasury Department's CARES Act program, ostensibly to help maintain freight capacity during the COVID-19 pandemic. The loan came with strings attached. The government took a 30% equity stake in Yellow and imposed restrictions on executive compensation and dividend payments. It was supposed to be a bridge loan to help the company survive the pandemic and complete its restructuring. Instead, it became a lifeline that allowed Yellow's management to delay the inevitable for 3 more years. The company used the money to service its existing debt and fund the continued failure of One Yellow, but it couldn't address the fundamental problems that were killing the business. By 2023, Yellow was out of options. The One Yellow integration had failed spectacularly, leaving the company with a patchwork of incompatible systems and demoralized workers. Major customers had fled to competitors. The Teamsters were preparing for a strike that would shut down operations entirely. On July 30th, 2023, Yellow's board of directors made the decision that would define the company's legacy. Rather than continue fighting for survival, they chose to liquidate immediately. No advance warning to workers, no gradual wind-down to help customers transition their freight to other carriers, no attempt to preserve any part of the business that had employed 30,000 people. The text messages went out at dawn. Drivers pulling loads across the country were ordered to abandon their trucks at the nearest terminal. Dock workers arriving for their shifts found locked gates and security guards. The betrayal was complete. Workers who had given decades of their lives to Yellow were discarded like broken equipment. But the real betrayal wasn't just the jobs that vanished overnight. It wasn't just the $700 million in taxpayer money that disappeared into the corporate graveyard. It wasn't even the thousands of customers left scrambling to find alternative carriers for their freight. The real betrayal was the $2 billion crater Yellow's collapse ripped into the American freight market. This wasn't just a business failing. It was a total system failure that left the national supply chain scrambling. When the gates finally locked, the wreckage stretched far beyond the balance sheet, leaving taxpayers, creditors, and families to deal with the fallout of a century-old empire falling apart in real time. The collapse put a target on the retirement security of every single Yellow worker. threatening to leave a massive hole in the Teamsters' pension funds. These were benefits promised to workers who had spent decades on the road, now suddenly left in limbo. Along with their paychecks, the entire workforce saw their health insurance vanish overnight. For the veteran drivers and dock workers nearing retirement, the gate wasn't just locked, it was slammed shut on their future. Yellow's customers, suddenly without their primary freight carrier, were forced to bid against each other for capacity on an already tight trucking market. These shippers saw their costs soar as they were forced to pay market rates to more efficient and more expensive competitors. Small manufacturers and distributors who had relied on Yellow's budget-friendly network were left stranded, suddenly unable to move their products without gutting their profit margins. The ripple effects spread through supply chains across America. Companies that had built their logistics around Yellow's network were forced to redesign their entire distribution strategies. Some raised prices, passing the cost on to consumers. Others simply went out of business, unable to compete without reliable, affordable freight service. The collapse eliminated a major competitor from the trucking industry, reducing competition and giving the remaining carriers more pricing power. Regional economies that had been built around Yellow terminals watched their largest employers vanish, taking with them the restaurants, gas stations, and service businesses that had depended on Yellow's workers. Yellow's bankruptcy filing revealed the full scope of the financial carnage: $1.5 billion owed to creditors, hundreds of millions in unpaid bills to suppliers, and a fleet of trucks and trailers sold at auction for pennies on the dollar. But even those staggering numbers couldn't capture the human cost of a betrayal that had been 20 years in the making. The workers who built Yellow's reputation for reliability and service were the last to know and the first to suffer. They had trusted their company to honor the implicit contract that had governed American business for generations. Work hard, be loyal, and the company will take care of you. Instead, they got a text message and a locked gate, victims of a $2 billion betrayal that destroyed everything Yellow had once stood for